What's going on, everybody? This is Andrew. He's John, and that means this is Sasquatchers. Tonight, we have a very cool guest. His name is Joshua Cutchin. He's an author of a lot of very interesting books, and we're going to have a little chat with him right after the intro. You know the drill.
The truth is out there. Never stop looking. Never be sheep. Always disrupt. We are the ungovernable. We are the truth seekers. We are Sasquatchers.
And that's the intro. Hello, Joshua Cutchin. Thank you for joining us tonight. We appreciate it. I'm just going to go ahead and pass to you, let you introduce yourself to the audience, and talk to us just a little bit about what brings you to the show, your background, your books, and whatnot.
Well, thanks so much for having me here. It's an absolute pleasure. I am, so there's there's this thing that I sometimes ask people, what's your airplane answer? And people are like, what does that mean? And I say, when you're sitting beside a stranger on an airplane and they ask you what you do, what's your airplane answer? And so my airplane answer, depending on how comfortable I get with people, is I'll say I'm an author of speculative nonfiction. And that's the best way to sort of avoid saying that I write about UFOs and Bigfoot and the Fae folk and stuff like that. I am the author of, depending on how you count, because some of them have been split in two because they got a little bit too long to fit into one book, 7 books of nonfiction on the paranormal. I have just released my novel recently in August, but all the other books are nonfiction of the paranormal. My primary focus is on a comparative look at a lot of these topics. One of the things that really got me into looking at the paranormal a lot more seriously were the similarities between modern UFO encounters and the older fairy folk encounters that you would see in Western Europe, but really worldwide, because the fairy folk were a worldwide phenomena. But that's pretty much what I do, is I take a look at a lot of these modern encounters and compare them to other things in the religious experience across different mythologies, because I remain convinced that somewhere in these tiny details that people have overlooked, we might find some answers. Maybe not the answer, but some answers. So to that extent, my first book was in 2015. It was all about the food and drink exchanges that happened in some of these paranormal encounters. It was called a Trojan Feast. My second book was in 2016. It was called The Brimstone Deceit, which is all about paranormal smells, not just the smell of sulfur and brimstone, but just other smells in general, because nobody had ever actually, taken a deep dive on that sort of topic. 2018's Thieves in the Night, which was a history of supernatural child abduction and how that particular belief and motif has evolved over the years. 2020's 2-volume set Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, which is kind of your one-stop shop for all things weird Bigfoot. And also my 2-volume set that I released last year, Ecology of Souls, New Mythology of Death and the Paranormal, which takes a look at the ways that our belief in death intersects with a lot of different paranormal phenomena, and maybe holds the key to understanding the purpose of these things in our lives. So that's a thumbnail sketch of my my career so far, such as it is.
That's an interesting thumbnail sketch too. I think I told you before we started recording that the books that you have written they're pretty unique, and like you touched on, a lot of people really haven't gotten too deep into the stuff that you've kind of created that corner for yourself, and so it's really interesting, and I want to definitely get into a couple of those topics with you if it's cool. But
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that sorry if I could just interject here.
Yeah.
My sort of guiding saying is that, for example, in ufology, like ufology needs another book on Roswell, like a submarine needs a screen door. You know what I mean? Like we've just got
Yeah.
we got plenty of books on crash retrievals and all this other stuff. Let's take a look at the really tiny stuff that people might mention in a sentence or even in a paragraph, but they never really dig in and see, you know, what that could tell you about the broader phenomenon. So yeah.
Right. And then of course, you know, right off the top of my head, when you talk about kind of like smells or something that might be um happening during certain paranormal events. We have Bigfoot. You know, the show's called Sasquatchers. You know, we talk about everything. It took forever to get to Sasquatch, actually.
Just recently.
We're finally getting Sasquatch content on
Nice.
Sasquatchers. But, you know, there's always like a musk or a scent or a smell, and everybody just kind of agrees that it's there. And then that's the end of it. There's not any really deep dive into that part of the lore other than it's there. So I think it's a super interesting topic, and just to even write a book about it, I think it's super creative, and I applaud it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. You know, I kind of have a soft spot for the brimstone deceit because it was one of those things that you will read about all across this paranormal literature. You know, mentioning certain similarities of smells, but you know, the history of the way that people have described smells in general, but especially smells in the paranormal. Um, People oftentimes use the wrong terminology for what they're smelling, and you know, if you just say something smells like sulfur, well, there are different sulfur compounds that seem to be alluded to according to the description. So there was a lot to unpack in there. But yeah, a full third of that book, the book is roughly structured into three parts. A third of it is you know, ghost and spirit smells. A third of it is smells in the UFO contact experience, both seeing, you know, structured craft and aboard craft allegedly, and a third is also on Bigfoot smells. And it's kind of frustrating to see the dialogue in the Bigfoot community where they'll say things like, you know, isn't it funny that Bigfoot always has this smell and it's described certain ways? Huh, I guess that's interesting. I'm like, but I've done the biggest you know, exploration of that topic of anybody so far. Now, granted, my conclusions are not always popular amongst the Bigfoot crowd, especially the flesh and blood Bigfoot crowd. But that doesn't mean that, you know, what's being described and just taking a look at it isn't sort of worth further examination. And yeah, it's interesting about the Bigfoot smells because it does seem like if you read these stories, you start to notice certain patterns. Like it just flips on and off like a switch. You know, sometimes the smell will just come out of nowhere and hit people. And there have been a lot of different ideas that have been proposed. Some of them make more sense than others. There, you know, have been allusions to perhaps scent glands, given the fact that they can, you know, sort of turn on at a moment's notice. There doesn't seem to be the use of a consciously activated scent gland in primates. There are certain musks and odors that animals like gorillas will exude whenever they're under stress. But as far as something like we would see in a skunk or another mustelid, there's nothing quite like that. At the same time, you have people who say, oh, well, you know, Bigfoot's capturing skunks and ripping out its scent glands and rubbing it all over its body. And it's like, well, I don't know if that's entirely true either. And then, yeah, you sort of look at some of these stories, and you know, the book is called The Brimstone Deceit because there is this sort of through line across these different supernatural modalities of the sulfur smell, various sulfur compounds, hydrogen sulfide, sulfur dioxide, things like that. But it is interesting to see that a lot of those Bigfoot encounters do seem to describe hydrogen sulfide, that rotting egg smell, which we associate with, you know, farting and decomposition, things like that. And you know, it was kind of a tricky book to write in the sense that I'm not sure if I came to much of a conclusion. You know, I did offer a possible, you know, speculative reason for a lot of these different smells, but at the same time, it was just like, let's just gather all this information in one place for people to be able to reference in the future. You know,
How did you go about researching this topic? Is this something that you just kind of, you know, collectively took a bunch of articles or posts online, or did you actually talk to
He went and
experiencers?
smelled a Bigfoot.
Right?
What are you not getting about this, Drew?
That's
You
my
know,
fault. That's my
No,
fault.
no, you're fine. No, I have a couple of different methods, and it sort of changes from project to project because my own personal library gets bigger and bigger. But I do go through my personal library. I have the back issues of a lot of different publications that I go through, publications with a focus on things like UFOs and cryptozoology. I very much scour the internet. Google Books is a great resource. Some of these older sources have been digitized as well, so that's extremely important. I generally don't go to places like Reddit, even though I'm sure that I've overlooked some really great, genuine encounters at places like that. I just can't put that in a book. It's my own personal, threshold of knowing whether or not someone's lying or not. But at the same time, was that, yeah, yeah. But at the same time, I don't really necessarily stress too much over, vetting every single case that I come across, because what I'm generally looking for when I write these books are these broad themes. And so if one of the cases that I talk about was later proven to be a hoax or something, it's like, okay, well, let's move on to the other, 15 that I talk about that have this exact same aspect in them, so that doesn't bother me as much. But what I do is I end up citing all my books really well. I've kind of become known for that. I think my last collection, the Ecology of Souls books, had about 4,200 endnotes in them. In fact, there's an entire third book in the Ecology of Souls series that's just just endnotes and appendices and the bibliography. So, but there are a lot of things that people who are involved in the paranormal, I don't think they are inclined to look in some of these places. For example, with Brimstone Deceit, I was going to my university library, and I would, part of what I do is I have a couple of books in mind that I want to get from the university library, and part of it I just wander the stacks because something always jumps out at me. But looking at things like the history of the study of smell, there's an entire discipline dedicated to the philosophy of smell, if you can believe that as well. And what ends up happening is that you end up tracking down something that's really interesting that's mentioned. You track it down in the references, and you end up finding that source as well. A lot of what I do looks at older religious texts, older folklore. I do a ton of looking at folklore, and for that I have access to some of these older journals, some of these academic journals, which have been incredibly helpful as well in that search. So it's a little bit of everything. I'd say that every book probably has 4 or 5 firsthand encounters of people who come to me with stuff once they hear I'm working on a project, but it's definitely not the bulk of what I'm looking at. Well, a lot of what I'm looking at are accounts that have already been out there and published and discussed. I'll try to track them down as far as I can to the original source. But unfortunately, people who are into these topics are not the best archivists in terms of, making sure that they have everything organized. And, a lot of this stuff, if you look into it, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Albert Rosales' humanoid database, but he's compiled literally over a century's worth of humanoid encounters into some different PDFs, and I have a good relationship with Albert, and I've had permission to work with those. But sometimes, the exact source of where these things came from gets a little bit fuzzy. Albert has always been truthful in his presentation of these cases, but sometimes, they came from a website, like an old GeoCities website that has been offline and wasn't archived by the Wayback Machine and all that stuff. So you kind of have to just say, okay, this story would have been lost to time if it wasn't for the diligent work of a couple of really enthusiastic folks out there. So it really is a smorgasbord. It wasn't a very clean answer that I gave you, but it really is a bunch of different things that I look at.
Oh, that's good too. That also speaks to your ability as a researcher to go in depth and not just interview somebody and take somebody at their word. So
right. Well, I appreciate that. I see a trend every now and then. It's gotten better than it used to be, but there's a trend every now and then where people who are primarily involved in field work will dismiss the efforts of people who don't get into the field. And I understand that impulse to a certain degree, but at the same time, we need astronauts and we need astronomers. We need people on the ground to analyze
Right.
data when it comes back, right? People who, for various reasons, don't have the opportunities or the financial means or the training or whatever to go places. So I think that in a perfect world, both field researchers and people who are bookish, like myself, work in tandem really well. Although I have made a lot more excursions out into the field in the past year, not had a lot of luck because sometimes I think I'm paranormal kryptonite, but that is something that I have made an effort to do more in the past year. And it's one of my New Year's resolutions for 2024 is to get out there more into the thick of things and see what happens.
Are you
Us
working
too.
on a book like that at all? Is that something that you're doing specifically for work, or just because you're interested?
No, honestly, man, I just need my cup filled. I've had a couple of things happen to me over the years, but I really want to. It's going to sound probably a little bit too religious, but I kind of want to have my faith replenished a little bit, reinforced. Refreshed, I guess. Um, and I think I might have had something. I might have seen something interesting just a couple of weeks ago when I was out in the field. But prior to that, the last truly anomalous thing that wasn't a synchronicity, and the value of synchronicities lies in the eye of the beholder, right? The last valuable thing interesting thing that happened to me that wasn't a synchronicity was probably 2013 or so. That's not entirely true now that I think about it, but yeah, I just want to have that firsthand experience a little bit more than I have. It's been a while since I've had something that made me pick my jaw up off the floor, so to speak. So that's the primary reason, and I'm sure it might influence my writing in some ways as well. Although it will be a while before I have enough personal encounters to fill my own book. That's for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine. You got to really be out there all the time to be putting books out on that. We are also, starting to get out there a little more. And I don't know if I'd be doing that if it wasn't for this show. It's always been, an interest, and I always wanted to go out. I remember being a teenager, and one of the things that really struck a chord with me was the Beast of Bray Road. I've talked about it a little bit on the show, how it was an inspiration to me, but like, I'm in high school. I'm like, man, I can't wait. I'm going to graduate. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to grab this car. I'm going to go live in this car. I'm going to go to Michigan. I'm going to research. I'm going to find this dog man. And, life happens, and that didn't quite work out. And, this sense of wonder never really goes away.
Yeah.
And I think it's the work that we're doing now is really, pushing in that direction. So we have all kinds of stuff that we have ready to go.
Well, it's nice to have an excuse, right? Because this what I do has turned into an occupation. But for me, it's less about making an income from this stuff, and it's more about justifying the amount of time that I want to spend on it. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's the exact same sort of thing. Where are y'all located again?
I'm in Pennsylvania. He's in
Okay.
Ohio.
Okay.
Cleveland.
Okay.
Yep.
There's plenty of weird stuff in y'all's neck of the woods,
Oh,
Yeah,
we got some stuff planned.
Okay.
Just right in
good.
the sporting stadiums over in Cleveland. You see everything that you write about just there watching the Browns.
He's just in the parking lot.
Yeah, right. Some strange stuff goes down. Yeah, I have a real soft spot for I guess it would be southeastern Pennsylvania because it's where my co-author of the Bigfoot books, Timothy Renner, lives. And that was the last thing that I had happen to me that was kind of a maybe incident. Just happened with me up there the day before Thanksgiving of this year. We were
in Pennsylvania.
This would have been kind of around Lancaster.
Okay. That's not far from me.
Although it might have been York County, I'm not sure, but it's one of Tim's research sites, and there have been large shadows that have been seen there. The first time I went, this is actually my third time going to this particular research site with Tim, and the first time that I went there, we pulled up and we parked the car and we got out, and within seconds, there was the sound of something large that huffed very audibly and very close to us. It didn't sound like a whitetail. And I'm always kind of bad at judging whether or not something is walking on two legs or four, But this did not really sound like the dainty four-legged tiptoe of a deer. It sounded like something with two legs shuffling away. So who knows? There's been a lot of odd stuff at this particular site. But that was the only thing that happened that first time. The second time I went back, it was dead as a doornail. And then this was the third time, like 4 years later, that I was able to visit. And we went deeper into the site than we ever have. And, in addition to the shadows that are seen there, the area is really famous for ghost lights, basically, is what you can call them. Sometimes these sightings get really dramatic. Sometimes, they stay off in the woods. And sometimes you can... sometimes you can clearly identify them as something that's not a light from any other source. But sometimes they get especially dramatic. The gentleman who was with Timothy and I on this particular excursion was someone who had one of these lights come up to him so close that he thought he could reach. He tried to reach out and touch it. And when he did, the light winked out. From his vantage point, this light was about the size of a golf ball or a ping pong ball. Tim was standing more or less at a 90-degree angle, and what Tim saw was like a pinpoint of light, which I think is, I don't know what that means, but I think that's really interesting. Maybe it says something about perception or something. But what I did see at this time, the day before Thanksgiving, we went back into the site, and it was a light that I at first thought was a headlight, moving in the crook of a tree from about the 4 o'clock position to the 10 o'clock position diagonally, right to left, or lower right to upper left, I guess, if you're thinking. For about 3 seconds, blinked behind some foliage, maybe twice, so blink, and it sort of disappeared. I was convinced that it was a headlight, but granted, it was only one of these lights, but that was definitely the sort of quality that it had. And I talked to Tim and some other gentlemen, and they said, no, there's no road there. And they're like, you're seeing that on it, because I was assuming that there was a road or a pathway along this mountainside that I saw it from. They're like, there's no road there, and couldn't have been an ATV because we all would have heard it. I was the only person who saw it, but they said, there is no road there. We will take you on our way out and to show you that, like, where you would have seen that there is no road. And sure enough, there wasn't. So,
nice.
Was that that's how so many of these things sort of fall into that category, right? It's kind of a maybe thing. A lot of my stuff ends up being a maybe thing. But anyway, that was kind of an interesting moment for me to have that. So that's probably the most recent interesting thing that's happened to me. But there's plenty of strangeness to be found all throughout Pennsylvania. Like I would argue that, alongside, maybe Wisconsin, any of the West Coast states, Pennsylvania is right up there as just one of the places that seems to have everything. Everything seems to be everywhere in Pennsylvania. Yeah.
It seems, I don't know if it's related or not to our, we're adjacent with the Appalachian Mountains, and it runs up through Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously the farther south that goes, you run into a lot of those areas like Tennessee that have had just like an insane amount of kind of, I don't know if old world paranormal makes sense to you.
Yeah, no, I've given a lot of thought to this because, I've given a lot of thought to this in regard to West Virginia. Which it literally seems like every holler in West Virginia has its own dedicated cryptid. And I kind of wonder if the reason that that's not happening isn't because of, as you alluded to, some of these, the same means of living that their ancestors brought over to the New World haven't really, continued. I mean, you've got these communities who don't really rely as much on electricity as the rest of us. Their internet is spotty. If they need something, they talk to a neighbor. These right. old ways of living that we all used to sort of engage in at one point. And I kind of wonder if that's sort of those older traditions haven't sort of kept some of these beliefs alive. And with the way that I tend to think about these phenomena now, I do think that they are in part fueled on belief and on imagination and storytelling. Not to say that they're imaginary. I think that they can have a very real component when they see fit. But I do think that whatever this is, whatever we're confronting in a lot of these cases, whether it's cryptids or UFOs or the fairy folk, I do think that they straddle this strange line between the physical and the psychic, or the physical and the non-physical, in a way that we don't quite understand.
I'm glad that you brought the fairy folk up. From day one, that's an episode we've been wanting to do. We've researched it here and there. We haven't had anybody yet who could speak about them, and now we have you. So I want to pick your brain about that. I know very little. I'm a layman, so I don't want to offend you or even sound like I know more than I do.
You're fine.
But I would love to have you, tell us a little bit about that, because it seems like every culture has them and they have different names for them. And of course, a fairy in Ireland is a lot different than a fairy that's happening in Hawaii. So, what are, what's the key differences there exactly?
Well, a lot different, and a lot, I mean, to a certain degree, there are a lot of differences, but I'm always struck by the similarities. So I guess the first thing to sort of get out of your head is the way that the fairies have been beaten into our head with popular culture. A lot of us tend to think of these little tiny, dainty, feminine characters with wings, and they're kind of sweet, and they are whimsical and all this stuff. That is mostly an evolution that you'll see in Victorian era children's books. The fairies were never given wings until at that point. They were always ascribed powers of levitation, but never insect-like wings. And they had a tendency to be small, but they were never restricted in that sense. They could be as tall as an average human being, and they certainly weren't always sweet. They weren't always negative. I would say, capricious is the word that I like to use. If you're good to them, they're good to you. And if you're disrespectful or you violate some unspoken rule that you didn't know existed, then they could do anything, up to including blinding you, striking you ill with a disease, or, killing you or taking you. They had a real affinity for abducting vulnerable members of a population, women and children, typically, in a lot of these narratives. And as you alluded to, they weren't exclusively Western European. That's the traditions that we in the modern day are most familiar with. Elves from Scandinavia and fairies from Ireland, and maybe every now and then we'll talk about Scottish brownies and things like that. But they really did seem to be something that you will find in any population across the world. And it's kind of uncanny because some of these similarities get really striking. What I mean by that is, if you look at some of the things that people normally associated with the fairy folk, you can find analogs in the New World that, if they aren't some sort of cultural contamination from Europeans, are describing the same thing objectively. One survey of 300 indigenous American tribes found that 85% of their mythologies had little people stories. The stories that I find most interesting, not only because of where I am, but because of how strikingly similar they are to those old world legends, are the stories of the Cherokee Nunyanehi. There were several varieties of Cherokee fairies, just as there were multiple varieties everywhere you go. A lot of these names were region dependent, but sometimes within the same region you'd have different factions and different appearing fairies described in different places. Amongst the Cherokee down here, they would describe the Yunwi-Chunsi and the Nunyanehi were among the fairies that they described. And the Nunyanehi, I mean, you have stories about people going to spend time with a Nunyanehi and having missing time, which is a big factor in not only the European fairy folklore, but also in the modern UFO, mythos, where you spend 5 minutes with them and it's been 5 years in the real world, or vice versa, depending upon the exact story. You'll find a strong association between the Nanyanahi and earthworks, these sort of mounds and artificial tumuli, which are the exact same things that you see in Europe. The strong association between the fairy folk and burial mounds and other sort of earthworks and hills and whatnot. So it really is sort of amazing to see those parallels discussed, so far across the globe. And where I've sort of arrived at over the course of my research and the course of my education in this regard is that these stories never really went away, and they're just as present now as they ever have been. I mean, first of all, there's the influence of fairies on culture, which we constantly overlook the significance of. But the medical term stroke is a reference to the fairy stroke, that you've been touched by one of the fairies, and that's where we get that term from. It's a direct.
Oh, wow, I did not know.
Yeah,
that.
it's a direct. That's the direct origin of that. Similarly, the color cobalt was named after a version of the Tommyknockers that you would see in Germany called kobolds, who were this sort of brilliant blue color. So there are these words and these things and these assumptions that we have throughout history, at least the English world, where we've borrowed a lot of these terms. A great example that I also love to point out is this idea of the fairy blast. And the words blast, blister, and blustery all share the same Germanic root. And the idea was that on a blustery, windy day, if you offended one of the fairies, they would hit you with a fairy blast and give you a blister. And it could do a lot of things. It could completely impede the use of an appendage like an arm or a leg. And sometimes the only solution would be to open it up. And once it was opened up, it would be any variety of detritus and just trash and debris inside. It could be a bit of a tooth or a stick or an old nail or something, something like that. And that's really interesting because, if you look at some of these alleged implants that alien abductees have received, when they're opened up, they're quite often found to be what appear to be mundane bits of, ceramic or something that's been lodged under the skin, and the body naturally calcifies, around that particular foreign body. So, after looking at all this fairy folklore and all the UFO stuff, I really have only agreed more and more with the assertion made by French ufologist Jacques Vallée in his 1969 book Passport to Magonia, which was that these modern modalities of UFO contact and alien abduction do seem to be reinventions of these older encounters with the fairies. I mean, I mentioned that implant connection, but you've got the missing time thing. You've got, fairies used to dance in circles and leave rings of mushrooms behind, and nowadays you have crop circles. Anomalous lights were always associated with the fairies. There are even some, if you look at the stories of the fairies, like the fairies themselves were often short, but the fairy king or the fairy queen was taller and would supervise and guide them. Well, what do you hear in a lot of these abduction stories involving gray aliens, but the fact that these smaller drone or worker grays are the short ones, and there's always a taller one supervising. And we could literally do the rest of the show on this. Like I've compiled a list of all these similarities over the years. Another thing was being pixie led, which is this idea that the fairies could sort of draw you out into a part of the wilderness that was unfamiliar to you, or they could make a place that you were very familiar with appear, completely foreign to you. And that seems to be really similar to what we hear when people are sort of, in these abduction narratives where they're driving their cars and they're like, for some reason I turned down this road and I have no idea why I turned down this road, but that's where I saw the craft. You hear this time and again, especially in the work of folks like Bud Hopkins. Yep. So
I just read in Intruders over the summer.
Yeah, I think there's some examples just like that in there. Yeah.
Yep, fascinating read.
So yeah, it's gotten to the point where I'm like, I used to sort of hedge my bets and be like, I'm pretty sure that you can find, an antecedent for one and the other, and like you can make a comparison, even if you kind of have to tilt your head and squint. But after looking at this long enough, I think that everything in fairy folklore has a counterpart in the UFO literature and vice versa. The thing to be careful of, and this is where a lot of people misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that the aliens today are fairies. And I'm not saying that the fairies back then were aliens. I'm just saying that it seems to be the same thing. And exactly how we describe it seems to be influenced by culture and belief and things like that. But the phenomenon itself has remained sort of constant. It's just the mask that either it chooses to wear, or the mask that, quite frankly, we give to them or give to it. That changes, it seems to me, at least. That's where I've sort of arrived. Not a very popular opinion amongst some folks nowadays who are talking about UFO crash retrievals and things like that, who are dead set on the extraterrestrial hypothesis being the answer to the UFO question. But I just see too much of this stuff. And then when you bring in the high strangeness, synchronicities, and people contacting dead loved ones during alien abductions, these things happen. They just don't get addressed that much. The consciousness connection. It seems to me that we're dealing with something that's a little bit more metaphysical than little green scientists coming down here from another planet in a spaceship. But that's, again, I'm not going to fight anybody over it. It's just where I sort of landed.
It's kind of crazy to me how argumentative our researchers in the paranormal become, and how a line in the sand is drawn, and it just seems like you're on that side of the argument or you're on this side of the argument, and there's just never anything in between that is agreed upon. And I just don't understand why that is.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing that I've noticed. So when Timothy and I wrote Where the Footprints End and released it in 2020, the reception to basically the paranormal, for lack of a better term, in Bigfoot sightings was being more talked about. And I think it came out at just the right time. But even to this day, there are people who get really upset about the introduction of these topics. And part of me understands, because, cryptozoologists have this thing where they want to sit at the cool kids table in the cafeteria. They want to sit with the scientists and be like, I told you so. It's a Gigantopithecus. Here we go. But at the same time, I'm over here saying, look, I'm into the strange stuff, and I value your research as a flesh and blood cryptozoologist. Like, I think you are bringing important information to the table. And a lot of the people who are into high strange Bigfoot really admire the traditional cryptozoologists. But there is a very vocal subset of the traditional cryptozoologists who have no time for any of this stuff that we're discussing. And I've heard it too many times from people who were in organizations like, the North American Wood Ape Conservatory or the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. I've heard it too many times about these stories about, believing a witness's account until the moment that, the Bigfoot turns into an orb of light, and then you throw it into the garbage bin. And it's like, well, they were credible to you like moments before you got to that part of their story, And then you also have this really troublesome thing. I was in an interview one time, and I was talking about these stories of Bigfoot disappearing. And, the person who was interviewing me said, well, couldn't that just be that the Bigfoot ducked out of sight or hid behind a tree? And I'm like, it could be. But if you keep walking that logic back to its final conclusion, you wind up telling the witness that they saw a bear, because, well, did you really see that? Well, did you really see this? Well, did you really see that? Did you really see this? Oh, I guess it's just as likely that you saw a bear. So I tend to err on the side of believing witnesses. And, I don't really like the idea that Bigfoot might be something more than a flesh and blood ape. My inner 12-year-old wants it to be a big monkey. I grew up on the same cryptozoological books that everybody else did. I think that, when someone's interested in Bigfoot, the first thing I do is give them one of Jeff Meldrum's books. Like, it's the gold standard. But I'm also, trying to be intellectually honest enough to say, we probably should have a body by now. Or, there are a lot of inconsistent things with the way that we retrieve a lot of this, physical evidence, like footprints. These, where the footprints end. It's in the title, right?
Yeah.
That end in the middle of a field. And, the explanations are that the Bigfoot use a tree to brush out their tracks, or that they, backpedal through their trackways, even though there's no sign of a double step when these footprints are examined, or that the Bigfoot jump to a nearby tree. And sometimes the nearest tree is like 200 feet away. And you're like, well, in the animal kingdom, the animals with the biggest leaps are the snow leopard and the klipspringer, which is a type of antelope. Snow leopard and klipspringer max out at a 50-foot vertical and 100-foot horizontal. So is Bigfoot the best jumper in the animal kingdom? And the cryptozoologist will say, yeah, Bigfoot's the best jumper in the animal kingdom. And then I'll say, okay, and they're also the only animal with bioluminescent eyes. Yeah, that's that too. And they're also forest ninjas who can duck completely. It's just like, so you wind up with this scenario where for Bigfoot to be a flesh and blood creature, it has to be the best at like everything in the animal kingdom. And you're like, or we're dealing with something stranger. And that's sort of where one of the things that Tim and I hope to do with that book series, Where the Footprints End, is to sort of rescue some of those ideas that have been tossed into the waste bin. Yeah. Sorry, that was a little bit of a rant there. Sorry.
No, rant all you want. I love it. Like sometimes I get a little introverted and I like to sit here and just let our guests go because, I'll admit it, man. This show is a bit of a vanity project. I'm collecting you guys, and so. You're here and you're just telling me all this awesome stuff.
I am your Pokemon. I am your Pokemon. Just go ahead and collect me. Yeah.
But it's fun topic, and when you bring that up, that's exactly where I was just months ago. I started this show, and there's a person who's in our group, and we chat and we get along. But the first conversation I ever had with this guy, it almost reached an argument because. He was talking about portals and some of the stranger things that have been attached to Sasquatch. And even in September, I was so firmly on that other side of that line in the sand that that's not possible. This is obviously, it's a bipedal ape-like, human hominid creature. And, that's the end of it. And here's all the scientific reasons why this is. And as I started this show, literally every week has gone by. I've learned something new. I've been told something. An expert has given me insight. And just 3 months later, I'm like, man, I cannot believe I was so simple-minded on that subject.
But I mean, at the same time, you'd be surprised how many people don't budge, and don't change their stance on these topics. And I'm like you, I've never really quite understood that. I mean, I've collected a bunch of these portal stories. I don't know if I believe them. I don't know if I believe in cloaking Bigfoot either, but I still want to listen to these people, and I still think that these stories should be preserved because they still inform a lot of what people think about these things. I'm definitely more sympathetic to those ideas than I once was, but I just, and then I hear things from people that tell me that they just don't have a broad enough look at sort of paranormal topics in general. And that's been a big problem. And what I think is cool about a show like this is that you're looking at all this sort of different stuff, because once you start to look at, the ghost stuff and the cryptozoology stuff and the Bigfoot stuff and the consciousness stuff, then you start to see ways that, oh, this is kind of informing that, and this is kind of informing that. I mean, one thing that I run into with a lot of the Bigfoot folks is they say, you're saying Bigfoot is maybe a spirit of some sort, well, ghosts don't leave footprints. And I'm like, have you read any parapsychology books? Because that was one of the first ghost hunting tools, was to spread talcum powder on the floor and wait for footprints to manifest. Like, whatever we're dealing with here, at least in the ghost scenario, is intangible but can interact with the physical world. But the psi phenomena, the psi research, is just the best stuff that's out there. This is the work of folks like Dean Radin and Daryl Bem, to a certain degree with reincarnation stuff, Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker. But these are a lot of academics who are playing by the rules, using the same laboratory controls that a lot of their scientific colleagues would demand. And they have demonstrated that certain psi effects do have a better than random chance of interacting with, our consensus reality. It's not dramatic, nobody's winning the lottery and predicting lottery numbers, but there seems to be some sort of thing there. And when you take a look at the fact that a lot of these phenomena don't seem to respond well to the restrictions placed on them when they're in a laboratory setting, and you also look at the fact of what that whole suggestion implies, the idea that the internal world of our minds can interact with the physical world that we share with other people, then you're like, okay, well, maybe there is something, maybe this is kind of the same place that these things are coming from, where they are constantly just out of our reach, but yet they do leave burn marks in the ground. People do have stigmata on their hands if they're, the especially religious Christian devout. People do have dreams that predict the future, and there is something in the forest that we can't get a dadgum body of, but does seem to leave footprints and even hair and poop sometimes. So I think that I think that if I had a soapbox to be on, it would be that I wish more people would read books outside of their own little sort of discipline to sort of get that sort of interdisciplinary information and see what it can teach them about their particular field of study.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's called paranormal for a reason. The idea that so many people want to try to normalize all of this into a little box that it can be scientifically explained constantly is counterintuitive to what we're doing as researchers. I think.
Right. Well, and it's you'll run into this where it's like, the UFO people are like, well, the Bigfoot people are crazy, like, and the ghost people will be like, the UFO people are crazy, and I'm like, folks, we're all living in glass houses when it comes to the public at large. Like, we all look equally crazy.
If we could stop being cliques and realize that everyone else is looking at us as we're all the weird kids at that lunch table.
Yeah, 100%.
Let's get along and put all of our efforts into the same.
Yeah, and maybe band together, and and it's like I said, as much as I'm complaining, it has gotten better. You do have ufologists talking about altered states of consciousness and ayahuasca and using mushrooms and stuff. You've got cryptozoologists who are bringing ghost boxes out on their Bigfoot hunts. Like, you do see a little bit more cross pollination than you used to, and I think it is getting better. But I swear, I think that if you look at enough of this stuff and you have a sort of broad enough interest set, you do start to come away with I'm not saying it's all the same thing either. I think that maybe it all comes from the same place, or it uses similar methods of getting here, or maybe it is all the same thing. I don't know, but there is some sort of connection between all these different topics, and you will find them if you look.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm starting to lean, and I never did that before. Imagine that. I think I see some facts, I see some data, and then suddenly my opinion changes.
He's not very consistent.
The idea that we might be just leaning up against this next fourth dimension, and there's just this thin veil, and for whatever reason, something is able at that moment to cross over the veil, and here we are, and maybe they're just as shocked by the fact that they did it as well. Nobody ever seems to consider that.
Well, if you look at these stories, I mean, I mentioned Albert Rosales' humanoid database, but it's full of these stories where, the people in these accounts see the creature. I don't care if it's, a dog man or a mantis or a gray or a Bigfoot. They see the creature, and then the creature itself does a double take and looks surprised as well. There are tons of stories throughout the literature that mention that, about these things being surprised too. So I kind of wonder if we're not as much of a mystery to them as they are to us.
Right. And that's a good point there too. So I don't know your personal opinion on the film. I won't get into an argument if we disagree, but the Patterson-Gimlin film. Okay. So if you take that, as a fact, that's a real film, that's not a hoax. I could have shows upon shows upon shows analyzing and arguing each point, on each side of that argument. But for argument's sake, it's a real film. That's a real Sasquatch. It was caught off guard, and it got away from those people. And we had an expert on Sasquatch just last week who is from he's a First Nation North American up in British Columbia, Vancouver, Washington area. And, he said, absolutely that film is real. That image that you see, that Bigfoot is what the Bigfoots, at least in his region, look like. And, it was caught off guard, and it was trying to get out of there as quick as possible. And, I've come to learn that despite the fact that he's very widely known and popular, he's also quite contested in the Bigfoot research field. So again, everything just comes down to a matter of opinion. But again, now I'm the one that's going on and on. What's your take
I was
on that?
I was banned from a Facebook group.
I just part of me. Okay, so someone said this one time, and I love the quote, and I wish I could remember who it is. So if this person's listening, please write me and tell me it was you, because I love this quote. Someone said that the Patterson-Gimlin film is a remarkable piece of footage, regardless, because it's either remarkable because it shows a genuine Bigfoot, or it's remarkable and it's the most enduring hoax ever, right? Like it's the hoax that has defied all efforts to debunk it, And, I lean towards it being a genuine film, but at the same time, I get really frustrated with the paranormal. And this is kind of a weird philosophy, but I'll try to explain it. I get really frustrated with people having to have opinions on the yes or no nature of any of these things. Another person who's really influenced my work, I mentioned Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia. Another individual who's had a big influence on my work is George P. Hansen, who wrote a book called The Trickster and the Paranormal. And his entire thesis is that these topics thrive in this liminal zone, this in-between zone that is not really real and not it's not real, but it's not false. And it's always sort of in this area of disreputability and con men and
the back rooms.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it's that old trope of this is not true, but it's that old trope of every alien abductee living in a trailer park. It's this idea of this phenomena being pushed to what are the acceptable fringes of a society, and that's the trickster archetype. Not a trickster as an actual deity, but this archetype that sort of manifests on its own. And you think of other archetypes like the mother or the father, or some of these archetypes sort of manifest on their own, people in the hospitality business or or hospitals or anything like that embody the archetypes of a nurturing mother, that sort of thing. And his sort of thesis is that the trickster is baked into all this stuff, and that's why you do end up with so many things that are well, is it true or is it not? Or well, it looks like this person was faking stuff, but then something genuine happened to them, or it looks like something genuine happened to this person, then they started faking stuff. There's always this room for plausible deniability in these things. And the way that I've come to think of it is that there's something about reality in these spaces of disrepute that's a lot like the pH level in water. Certain organisms will die if the pH is wrong, right? So I think that the pH of disbelievability and believability has to be in this perfect balance for these things to even manifest in the first place. It's a bit of an esoteric idea, but I think it does get to the heart of the exact space that the Patterson-Gimlin footage exists in.
Yeah.
It makes you question if we're, like you said, being esoteric. It's almost like, are we manifesting all of this? Is this really something coming from another dimension, like a fourth, or is this something that we're producing on our own?
I hated that idea for the longest time because, again, my inner 12-year-old wants there to be a monster out there, that I can see someday. The idea that we might be somehow manifesting this stuff. I found distasteful, but there's a strong argument to be made. And when you look at stuff like, they've become a bit more popular online in the past couple of years, but ideas of tulpas or egregores, these thought forms that occur either at the individual or the cultural level, the idea of these thoughts that sort of take on a life of their own outside the owner. It's interesting. Have you guys heard of the Philip experiment?
I don't think that I have.
Yeah. The Philip experiment is one of my favorite stories. There was in this early 1970s, I think it was 1972, a group of Canadian parapsychologists decided to invent a ghost, and they invented this young boy who named Philip Aylesford, who was alive during the English Civil War, and they made up this entire, it's imagine making a story for your Dungeons and Dragons character, right? They gave an entire backstory and everything. And then they started having seances to try to see if they could conjure up Philip. The actual book, I believe, is called Conjuring Philip, to see if they could conjure up this fictional character. And they did. And when they asked, they had a seance and the table levitated or whatever, they would ask this spirit questions about Philip's life. Oh, you're Phil. Are you Philip? And it would answer the affirmative. And they ask questions about this fictional character's life. And the raps and the knocks that answered back always answered correctly according to the story that they had made up. And so the implications of that are staggering, and I think pretty obvious that it seems as if human beings have the ability to create these things on some level, if everything according to the Philip experiment actually unfolded as it was presented. You can invent a ghost, and it's wild.
I'm gonna look into that further. I find that really interesting on a couple of levels. I mean, the first one, as you just proposed, that we're able to do it. I will, a week from now, be sitting on my couch trying to conjure some comic book character I drew from high school. But,
well, there are those. It's kind of funny that you mentioned that. There's that famous story of Alan Moore. I don't know how big you are into comics, but Alan Moore actually encountering John Constantine. It was this character that walked up and he's like, that was John. Like, I don't know who it was. Walter Gibson, who did the Shadow, that character from the old radio serials and stuff. He had a Shadow character complete with hat lurking around in his house. So there do seem to be these characters that from time to time make the jump from fiction into reality. I can't tell you the mechanism. I can't tell you even, again, how much I believe that, but it's an aspect of this that at least needs to be considered if we're ever going to make any headway into getting to the root of these things.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting too. I never even considered something like Roger Rabbit or Cool World could theoretically then just actually occur right in front of my eyes.
Yeah, I mean, and people will tie this concept to this supposedly esoteric Buddhist monk philosophy of tulpas. And there's a whole subreddit dedicated to, there's an uncomfortable intersection of tulpas and My Little Ponies that you don't really want to look into. But Alexander David Neal, she was a researcher who spent some time with a community, I believe it was in Tibet, with these Buddhist monks, and they taught her this sort of secret tradition of creating a tulpa, which was a thought form. And according to Alexander David Neal, she actually invented this monk. She meditated on the idea of this sort of Friar Tuck character, who ended up manifesting and was eventually seen by other people in the throughout the where she was staying, and eventually sort of got enough independence that it started playing pranks on folks, and she had to sort of, through, I can't recall exactly the method, she had to sort of dispel it. Now, granted, I've talked to some people who've talked to some people who've talked to some people who have had audiences with high-ranking Buddhist practitioners, and with an interpreter in between. And they finally get in the room and they want to talk about tulpas, and the monk goes, "Huh?" So yeah. I don't know how much credence to put into that tradition, or if that tradition has been sort of corrupted by Western English academics and stuff, and paranormal enthusiasts are bad about that too. But it's an interesting idea that does seem to fit into that idea of something like the Philip experiment, and opens up a whole new can of worms for what we might be dealing with when we see cryptids and UFOs and things like that.
Oh, absolutely. And to connect them like that. And then there's another story, obviously it's a lot more recent and a lot different as far as practice goes, but that almost kind of vaguely mimics what happened with Slender Man, where 4chan created Slender Man, and then it turned into this big thing where, based off of this thing that they created on the internet, people are now seeing it, and eventually kids are out killing each other over it in the woods. And so that is also, I guess, like,
it's exactly the same idea. And there's this other idea of egregores that are these sort of forces that take on a life of their own at the cultural level. And it's again, I'm constantly at war with myself because I believe experiencers, um, you know, I believe experiencers. I've heard all these accounts. Some of them are accompanied by great physical evidence, but at the same time, we don't have proof. So once you're faced with that, you kind of have to start looking at other ways that both of these things can be true. The fact that we haven't proven these things, the fact that every photo does turn out blurry, but that also these people seem very genuine and very affected for the rest of their lives in a lot of these cases.
I can speak firsthand to that based on my own experiences. Some of the things that I've seen, I won't get super into it. This is the 15th time on this show that I've talked about it, and we're only 23 episodes in.
Right,
but,
right.
I had a UFO encounter, and to this day, I'm changed by it. I'm invited to a show tomorrow to talk about it, just, based on our own show kind of starting to make its way around the world and people discovering it and discovering my story. So now years later, I still have that fuzzy feeling inside, and honestly, like a peace within that I didn't have before. Then I'm going to talk about it tomorrow. And, that happened in 2017. It's now almost 2024. And something that has stayed with me is I almost yearn for it again. Like when I look up in the sky and I don't see them there, I'm a little disappointed. So it's crazy that, the connection that an experiencer can have.
Well, and here's the thing, man. I'm sure that when you've shared that story with other people who have seen UFOs, a lot of them know exactly what you're talking about. And that's what I find really fascinating is the fact that there's this sort of this sensation that you can't put into words, but it seems to be a shared experience that other people will agree, like, oh yeah, I know exactly what it is. Like that same feeling,
Yeah. It's almost like cult-like in the sense that
right.
So many cults, they offer that feeling, they offer that, and a lot of them are based off of, the galactics and, spirits from the sky coming down and alien this and spacecraft that. And I just watched so many cult documentaries over the last couple of weeks that all kind of fall into that same thing. But these followers of these cults, kind of almost fall in love with that sense that they're going to feel what I felt looking at some things in the sky, and I can relate to them that they allow themselves to kind of fall into that lifestyle because they're chasing that thing that I'm now kind of chasing.
Well, and so that makes perfect sense to me because a lot of the people that I've been finding a lot of resonance with, not only in terms of me appreciating their work, but them appreciating my work, have a background in religious studies. Not to say that we should worship the UFO or that the UFO is God or anything, but just saying that a background of religious studies and that sort of framework seems the best way for dealing with these experiences, at least in terms of the effect that they have on people. I have my own personal suspicions about what that implies, but setting that to the side, the rule of thumb that I would always use is, be careful when the stories get really specific. So I call it the Star Wars problem. Like, I will believe some of the strangest UFO stories all day long, but when people get really specific about where these things come from and what their names are, and I kind of start to go, are you not even, are you making this up, but are you allowing your own suspicions and your own attempts to reconcile this? Are you allowing that to come in and influence, where you are? So when people are like, the Seth-Narflian alliance has been at war with the Zebel-Nebians, it's like, okay, well,
Sure, you didn't just get that from Rick and Morty last
night. Right, yeah.
Leave the Zebel-Nebians out of this.
But when people come to you, and like those are always the people who I find the most compelling, are the ones who come to me and they say, I don't know what this was. These aspects of it really still bug me. They seem to defy logic, but I can only tell you what I experienced, and that's it. Those are the people that I really am compelled by.
Yeah, we talked to Kenny Biddle last week, and he runs Skeptic Inquirer. He's total skeptic, and obviously, he was a fun guy. He was a cool hang, but he told me that his gut instinct tells me that I was looking at spotlights, and I'll tell you what, those spotlights gave me some of the best feelings that I've had within myself, like outside of the birth of my children or marrying my wife. Like it's created something so amazing for me that if I was a spotlight, cool. I know
this is the
how
best
it made me
spotlight
feel.
ever. Yeah. I mean, so this is something that I and this is probably going to be a little bit too touchy feely for some people, but regardless of what you saw, there is something real to it, and it's your emotions that you felt were real. And similarly, when people have these horrific experiences of alien abduction or something like that, or even seeing Dog Man or seeing Bigfoot, and they're terrified to go back in the forest, they are literally traumatized. The trauma is real, regardless of whether or not what they saw exactly happened like they thought it did. So when you sort of belittle these people's experiences, especially when they're bad experiences, you're either making fun of somebody with mental illness, or you're making fun of somebody who's been through something traumatic, and neither of those really sit well with me. Maybe I'm strange in that regard, but neither of those really sit well with me. And that's not to say that like you have to believe every single story. I mean, I think I've said it multiple times on here. Like, I'm not sure if I believe this or not, but this is what the literature says. But at the same time, like I would rather entertain. I would rather listen to 9 hoaxers and 1 genuine person and be, have the wool pulled over my eyes than to, make fun of 1 person who has actually been traumatized. So, I'll take it, and I'll have my own personal opinions about someone's story, but, outwardly I'm like, that's, I'm glad you shared that with me. Thank you, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we just need to listen to these people. There aren't enough advocates for experiencers, I don't think.
Absolutely. Advocacy is key here. Whatever happened to them, and that's their perception, and we just have to understand their perception. But we are coming to the end of the show, and
we just started.
See, what I like to do is I like to keep it at about an hour, because that means if you like me, you'll come back. I'd rather get 3 episodes out of you than 1 3-hour episode out of you.
We're milking it for all we can.
Well, I really appreciate it, because there are different levels of the conversation that's happening, and there are the people who will ask things like, well, what planet do they come from? And then there are the people who will sort of set that aside and be willing to entertain these sort of, I think, deeper questions, and they're the questions that I find more interesting. So the fact that we were able to go in these places, I really appreciate. Thank you.
No, you never did answer. You didn't tell us what ghosts smell like, though.
Oh, okay, yeah, fair enough. Well, ghosts smell like a lot of stuff. There's the most common things that you hear are cigar smoke and perfume. And in a lot of those cases, there is some strong evidence to suggest that some of these smells literally seep into the surroundings where a person once lived, and under the certain correct conditions, like temperature and humidity, can sort of leach back into the environment and give the impression of there being a smell there. At the same time, sometimes these smells are far too strong and far too sudden, and so rarely noticed, that it does suggest that there's some sort of smell associated with the spirit. And then, again, even though I talked about all sorts of smells in the Brimstone Deceit, there are these allusions to this sulfurous smell, either sulfur dioxide, the smell of gunpowder or fireworks, and hydrogen sulfide, that rotten egg smell. And usually, if a spirit smells bad, it's not a good spirit. That's generally the rule of thumb. So yeah.
Sometimes with people too, right?
Usually.
Yeah. Although I've known some very kind, stinky people in my life, so you just have to sort of overlook it. Yeah.
Those are the Sasquatch people that we encounter. But yeah, so we're at the end of the show. Go ahead. I always like to offer up the last couple of comments to our guest. Anything you want to promote? New book? You said you have your first actual fiction novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was something that I wanted to. Well, quite frankly, I kind of wanted to have some of those John Constantine Philip experiment kind of moments, because I've talked to enough authors, and almost to a person. Well, quite frankly, the good ones. will say things like, I wanted to write X or Y or Z, but this character wouldn't let me do it. And I'm always like, do you know what you're saying there? Like, do you realize that that's like paranormal adjacent to what you're saying? So I wanted to have some of those experiences, and I kind of did have some of those experiences where answers to plot elements and things like that would come to me when I least expected it. And it did feel like the idea that it did feel like I did get the sense that the idea of this book had me versus me having the idea for this book. So that came out on August 28th of this year. It's called Them Old Ways Never Died. It's a bit like a paranormal theory of everything that's in there a little bit, but also it's an homage to the Appalachian Mountains and how the spooky season starts on Halloween and doesn't end until at least the winter solstice or equinox. Always mix that up. Anyway, doesn't end until the shortest day of the year. So we're still in the spooky season, and so I'm really happy with the way it turned out. I wrote it for myself, and that's out there right now, as well as my most recent nonfiction book, the two-parter Ecology of Souls. So you can find information about all that at joshuacutchin.com, JOSHUACUTCHIN.com, and it has links to all my books and all my interviews and any sort of news about conferences where I'm appearing and stuff like that.
All right, awesome. And we will include all of that in the descriptions when we put this episode out. I want to thank you again for your time. This was a great conversation. I could pick your brain all night, but
well, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
So once again, we leave the Sasquatchers to see our awesome outro video that took some effort to make.
Thanks for watching.
And squash you later.